Imagine your country is at war, and there are opportunities for volunteers to fight for it. Well, I love my country, don't get me wrong, but I just don't see myself dying for it. I know I'm not the only American with this thought. In fact, during the Vietnam War, nearly 570,000 Americans avoided the draft, despite 1.97 million men being eligible for conscription. This staggering number of draft evaders reflects a deep-seated tension between patriotism and self-preservation. It's a question many faced back then, and one that still resonates today. How far would you go for your country? While some bravely choose to fight, others couldn't see themselves risking their lives for a cause they didn't fully support. The Vietnam War Draft, one of the most controversial chapters in American history. Imagine getting a letter in the mail, not from a college or a job, but from Uncle Sam himself, telling you it's time to pack up and head to Vietnam. Suddenly, your biggest problem isn't choosing between Burger King or McDonald's, it's figuring out how to survive in a war zone. Now, let me tell you, this draft wasn't just any ordinary mail. It was a life-altering summons for millions of young American men. You had just turned 18, probably more concerned about your next date or getting that driver's license, when boom, you're told to pick up a rifle and fight in a conflict halfway around the world. The pressure was intense. Society expected you to be a patriot, to step up and fight for your country. But here's the thing, not everyone was on board. I mean, who wants to risk their life in a war they barely understand? Some guys were probably thinking, Vietnam? I can barely find it on a map, and now I'm supposed to go fight there? Now, the draft wasn't a suggestion. It was more like, you're going to war unless you can find a way out. And boy, did people get creative with finding ways out. In fact, avoiding the draft almost became a national pastime. Let's explore the 7 sneaky ways that Americans managed to sidestep the draft, each with its own slice of historical context, and of course, a bit of humor. Number 1. College deferment. One of the most popular ways to avoid the draft was simply to stay in school. I mean, who knew that higher education could literally be a lifesaver? Suddenly, young men who barely cared about school were signing up for every class imaginable. It didn't matter what the subject was, if it kept them out of Vietnam, they were in. Picture this, college campuses filled with eager learners, not just because they were passionate about their studies, but because they were passionate about not getting shot at. Philosophy 101? Sure, why not ponder the meaning of life in a classroom instead of on a battlefield? In a way, it was the perfect plan. You were still contributing to society by becoming well-educated and all, but you were doing it safely behind the ivy-covered walls of academia. Number 2. Medical exemptions. Another classic draft-dodging tactic was claiming a medical exemption. This wasn't as easy as it sounds. You needed a doctor who was sympathetic enough or easily convinced to sign off on your condition. But once you found that doctor, you were golden. Guys suddenly developed all sorts of mysterious ailments. Flat feet, bad backs, asthma, you name it. And then there were the bone spurs. Yes, those infamous bone spurs. I mean, they kept Donald Trump out of the war, didn't they? It's funny how such a minor condition could have such a major impact. Apparently, these bone spurs only flared up when the draft board came knocking. In all seriousness, though, medical exemptions were a lifeline for many. Whether they had a genuine health issue or not, the goal was the same: avoid Vietnam at all costs. Number 3. Joining the National Guard. For those who wanted to fulfill their patriotic duty but weren't keen on dodging bullets, joining the National Guard was a popular choice. This was like signing up for a diet version of military service. You were still in the military, technically, but the odds of you seeing combat were much lower. The National Guard was sort of like the safe zone in a game of tag. You could serve your country, but do it from the relative safety of stateside bases. This was a particularly appealing option for those who wanted to avoid the stigma of draft dodging while still steering clear of Vietnam. Many saw this as the best of both worlds. You got to wear the uniform, serve your country, and sleep in your own bed at night. It was a win-win, as long as you didn't mind a few weekends of training and the occasional deployment for natural disasters instead of war zones. Number 4. Conscientious objector status. Claiming conscientious objector status was another route, although this one required a bit more paperwork and soul-searching. You had to prove that your moral or religious beliefs genuinely prevented you from participating in the war. This wasn't just a matter of saying, "Hey, I'm not really into the whole killing thing." You had to demonstrate a deep, consistent commitment to nonviolence. For some, this was a matter of principle. They couldn't, in good conscience, take up arms, no matter the cause. But for others, it was a strategic move. If you could convince the draft board that you were a true pacifist, you could avoid the draft while still maintaining some moral high ground. This path wasn't without its challenges. It often involved lengthy hearings and intense scrutiny, but for those who succeeded, it meant that they could stay true to their beliefs and stay out of Vietnam. Plus, they got to wear that conscientious objector badge like a Medal of Honor in the peace-loving circles of the time. Number 5. The marriage card. Getting married was another way to dodge the draft. Back then, being married, especially with kids, could reduce your chances of being called up. Suddenly, wedding chapels across the country saw a spike in business. Young couples were getting hitched faster than you could say "I do." Now don't get me wrong, love was definitely in the air, but so was the desire to avoid a one-way ticket to Vietnam. Some of these weddings were more about survival than romance. And hey, if it meant avoiding the war, a few shotgun weddings took on a whole new meaning. It's hard to say how many of these marriages were based on true love versus a shared fear of the draft, but either way, they served their purpose, keeping one more person out of the war zone. Number 6. Fleeing to Canada. For those who couldn't see any other way out, fleeing the country became a legitimate option. Thousands of draft dodgers headed north to Canada, where they found refuge from the draft. It was a drastic step, but for many it was the only option. Canada became the land of freedom for those who couldn't reconcile themselves with the idea of fighting in Vietnam. And let's be honest, there were worse places to end up. Free healthcare, stunning landscapes, and a government that wasn't forcing you to go to war? It's no wonder so many took the plunge. Of course, this wasn't an easy choice. Fleeing to Canada often meant leaving behind family, friends, and everything you knew. It also meant the possibility of never being able to return to the US without facing legal consequences. But for those who couldn't stomach the thought of combat, it was a price worth paying. Number 7. Failing the physical. And then there were the guys who just failed the physical. Whether by accident or design, failing the draft physical was a surefire way to avoid service. Some went to extreme lengths to make sure they didn't pass, gaining or losing weight, faking injuries, or even pretending to be mentally unstable. It sounds a bit like something out of a sitcom, but for many, this was serious business. The goal was simple: make sure the army saw you as unfit for service, no matter what it took. And while some of these tactics were a bit over the top, they were often successful. For those who pulled it off, failing the physical meant they could stay home, while others were sent overseas. It wasn't exactly heroic, but it was effective. And in a time when survival was the name of the game, that was enough. One of the most creative methods to avoid the draft was faking one's own death, living in secrecy for years to avoid military service. This extreme measure highlights the lengths some would go to, profoundly impacting their lives and friendships. Finally, I've got 2 questions for you. Would you have avoided the draft? How would you have done it? Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments section.